Judy, thank you so much for being here as part of the Confident Sober Women podcast. I am so excited to have our conversation today because so much of the work you're doing is actually literally things that I talk about very regularly in my work as a therapist in my private practice, as well as in coaching. However, I'm not a scientist and I haven't done the kind of research that you have. So I say it knowing the research is out there, but not being super privy to it. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you now and let you share a little bit more about your story, and then we're going to chat.
Sure, I'm excited to be here too. I started using drugs right about the time of my 13th birthday, kind of as most people do, a little bit on a whim. I just thought, oh, why not try this? And I ended up um, drinking half a gallon of wine at the start, and then that took a strong left turn in my whole life trajectory. It really informed everything else I did after that. It was such a powerful experience for me. I think it's kind of like the solution that I didn't know I was looking for, and once I found it, I was really off to the races. So I spent about 10 years using as many drugs as I could. I hear a bunch of feedback. I don't know if that's you or me, but it's all of a sudden got weird.
I don't hear it.
Um, okay, well, there was like another voice in there, but maybe it stopped. So can I just pick it up? Is that okay?
Go ahead.
So for the next 10 years, I took as many mind-altering experiences and substances as I could get my hands on. And as a result, kind of uh self-destructed, I guess, or started down that path. I was kicked out of 3 schools, beginning in 10th grade and 2 colleges. Um, I got hepatitis C using dirty needles. I was homeless. Nobody would talk to me. My family, disowned me more or less. Anyway, I kind of hit bottom over a series of months, beginning with, I think the clearest thing for me was that even though I was doing exactly what I thought I wanted to do, which was getting as messed up as I could, I was miserable. So anyhow, I got the opportunity to go to treatment. This was in the 1980s, and I literally thought treatment was going to be like a spa. And since I was so miserable, I thought, I deserve a spa. Right. That's exactly what I need, take me off the street and put me in a spa. So it wasn't that. It was I saw the nurses' uniforms and I kind of got freaked out. But anyway, I ended up staying, and when the people there and then in my halfway house told me that if I wanted to live, I was going to have to really change, I thought, no, I cannot give up drugs. They're my solution, not the problem. But I guess I had just a little bit of curiosity and and I had this determination that many of us have, which is like, don't tell me what to do. So I thought, I'll solve my problem. If I have a disease, you say that, can't be cured, can't, I have to quit, I'll just cure it. So I ended up going back to school and making this a long story, with this really sole intention of being able to use without self-destructing.
Mm.
And I had this cockamamie idea that it was going to take me 7 years, and I was going to do everything they told me to do for 7 years while I solved the problem. I miraculously became a neuroscientist in that process. It's just kind of a testament to determination, I think. Don't tell me. Anyway, so 7 years came and went. I was clean and sober that long by the skin of my teeth, mostly. And yet my life was many, many, many times better. So I kind of kept going. And now I just celebrated 37 years last summer in clean and sober. And again, my life is, beyond what I could have ever imagined. And I still am a neuroscientist who studies the biological basis of addiction. And what I wanted to understand, and still do, is what's different about the brains of people like me before I get started
Mhm.
And then as I kind of so powerfully succumbed, and then in recovery. And that turns out to be complicated. So it's been really entertaining and enriching process to try to learn about that and then to share that knowledge.
Mm. Thank you so much for sharing those parts of your story and being vulnerable and honest with us here. It really does make a big difference when we can hear the stories of other people, and this is how it works, right? So I definitely want to dive into the things that you just mentioned about the parts of the brain that you were most curious about. But first, I want to ask if you're willing to share a little bit more. One of the things that I focus a lot of my work on, and in our community we discuss a lot, is that after that initial phase of what I call kind of early sobriety, right? Maybe like a year or so. Sometimes it's a little longer for me. It's a little, it's multiple years, right? But around that 1 year mark or 2 year, like around that time-ish, we're obviously we're as sober and clean as we're ever going to be. Our bodies are as clean as they're ever going to be as far as substances are concerned. So much has generally happened that life is better. And there's a time when we start to kind of wake up to the world, right? To life, right? All the possibilities and opportunities that are around us that we could never even imagine before or entertain because we were in the midst of such a sickness are kind of bubbling up to the surface. And I call it like this great awakening. And many women that I talk to, and myself included, really have experienced this. And that's when like a lot of the real work of emotional sobriety starts to happen. I'm just curious if you can relate to that and like what that was like for you in your story.
Sure. Yeah, I guess it's different for every person. I can relate. I can remember probably about 4 months sober, walking down the street one day and feeling pretty crappy actually, because it was very hard. I hit bottom in South Florida. I was in Minnesota at the time. I didn't really know, it was far away from everything I thought I loved. And, it was hard. It was hard facing myself. There was a lot of things that I felt not prepared for, but I also felt, as I said, a kind of a commitment, a short-term commitment to this, to trying this. And anyway, I'm walking down the street one day, I think it was like October, and the leaves on the trees were outrageously colored. I could not, I, I remember, suddenly seeing these leaves that were yellow and green and red and orange and pink and purple and brown. I mean, it was just like fluorescent. And I remember thinking, how are all these people just walking by this?
Mm,
This is spectacular. And I realized I hadn't really seen any color in a while.
mm,
The only color, so to speak, that I remember was kind of the adrenaline drenched, you know, neon red kind of thing. It wasn't like this sort of beauty. So that was something that really touched me and was surprising. It came back like that. And I think in many ways, the early time, and I don't want to gloss over it because it for me, it was so hard.
mhm,
It took me, I think it was 14 months before I went through one day where I didn't want to have a drink,
mhm,
and years before I went through a day where I didn't want to smoke weed. So it was, trudging, I'd say. But there were these moments of realization, that I had choices, that I didn't have to do anything today,
mhm.
that I could go to sleep when I was tired, and um, maybe learn to tell the truth, which that took a while. But yeah, it was a long process. And as I look back on it, of course, it's so beautiful and interesting and courageous and adventurous. But at the time, it was like, hard.
Oh my gosh, it's probably the hardest thing we'll ever do in life, and Most of us have done some really hard things. Okay, so
Mhm.
thank you for sharing that, and I totally love your story about the leaves. It is an amazing, like I said, kind of this awakening. The fog is cleared, and we're starting to become aware not only of our surroundings, but then also opportunities, like I mentioned, and for you that look like school, right? You became curious, and the desire in your heart that really was bubbling up was deeper understanding about neuroscience, right? And so that's pretty incredible. So how did you get
Yeah.
yourself from like that recovery early? Because, most of us in the early stages, we're really doing a lot of repair work, and, physically and emotionally, but then also like educationally, like you mentioned, you'd already kind of messed up some of your educational traditional track, right? And so, how did you get back in and like actually start studying neuroscience?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if I would have that kind of chutzpah today, but I hope I would. I think I was always interested. I was a curious kid. My mother says I spent half of my first 10 years in a creek, kind of turning over rocks. So I just liked to see what was there. And so I'm naturally inclined that way. I was, as I said, kicked out of two colleges, and some of my majors had to do with biology. And so I think I had that ilk. And it just seemed obvious to me as I learned about my situation and kind of woke up to that, that there was something really different that made substances so compelling that I everything changed. So I kind of believed the hypothesis that there was, an issue in the brain. It was a problem in the brain or a mental illness of sorts. And so I think it fit my proclivities a little bit, but I think I also appreciated very much that I had something to do with my kind of compulsive nature that was obsessive and compulsive, around substances, but then I could take that and apply it to, say, um, flashcards and, reading and taking notes with highlighters and things. So for the first year I didn't go to school. The second year I started going to school and I really put myself into it. And I think that was served me well. I think some of the attributes that made me such a devastating addict, like not giving up and a high tolerance for punishment
Mhm.
and a relentless hunger were the same things
Mhm.
that really benefited me in finishing my undergraduate and then going to graduate school for 7 years and then a postdoc for 3 years. Those are good attributes. And I do think there's a lot of capital in us. I think we're uh, especially inclined to want more and want different and want other. And that is a really valuable uh, set of characteristics because it pushes not only ourselves, but, the planet, I think. So, getting that in my crappy apartment with the blinds closed alone, getting that sense was not nearly as reinforcing, it turns out, in the long run as getting it in a way that, uh, you know, for me involved experiments where I would get data, and the data was usually not great, but always surprising. And that was kind of a lot like chasing down a bag of something.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think that our greatest assets are our biggest liabilities, depending on the context, and um, making up my mind to choose a different context, let those things kind of be unmasked.
Mm. I love that, and I couldn't agree more with those qualities you're mentioning. We are a special type, I think, and for me, it was a little bit more physically inclined, like athletically inclined. So I pursued things like, I ran 5 marathons. I was always kind of working on my body, like being diligent about food and, trying to see what I could change and see how I could, push myself in those kind of ways. But it takes the same kind of thing, right? It's the same kind of drive. I've noticed as I've aged and gotten more longer in recovery, some of that has changed, right? I wouldn't say I don't have drive, but I don't have the same uh desire, or and maybe it's just energy, maybe I'm just old now. But anyway, I agree with you. And I actually just had a client. I have a young client in my private practice that I've been working with that I just adore, and is really new in addiction recovery, and literally says, I mean, she has a few months, but she says she's a chronic relapser. So like, this is not her first rodeo. And I just met with her yesterday, and we've been working, I use EMDR therapy, which is very neurologically based. So I really want to get into this next. But she said, I finally said to her, because I was having a hard time. She's challenging me a lot, which I love, but we were having a hard time coming up with a very specific target. And I finally said to her, like, because she keeps saying, I just know a relapse is inevitable, right? I know it is. I know it's inevitable. I miss getting high. I want to, do these things in my life that I have lined up for myself, and then I'm going to do that. And she knows it's delusional, but I said, what do you miss? Like, and she just described all the things, right? I miss the chase, the excitement of it, the pursuit, the phone call, the meeting, like sneaking around. And I thought, oh my gosh, like these are quality, these are things. I said, so it sounds kind of like what you're saying is you miss the adventure, you miss the excitement, the dopamine hit that comes with, all of those things. And, is it possible that you could find that in other things? You know?
That's such a great story. I can so relate. And I was about 7 years sober, and I was getting my PhD. I had just defended my thesis, which was like a 3 hour grilling by a bunch of old men, and I walked out of the room, and my colleagues, like my grad student colleagues, were all standing around, and they looked kind of sick. They looked almost like they were seasick to me. And I said, "What's up?" And they said, "We always celebrate with champagne, and we just didn't know what to do for you." And my first thought was, that's right. I should have some, crappy champagne in a plastic cup. I didn't think all that through. I was just like, you know what? Yeah, I deserve that. And then I thought I had enough time then to realize, it wasn't going to be that fun. But also, I thought, what would I like to do? So just this is in honor of your client, God lover, I thought, I'm going to go to New Zealand. And I
Mhm.
took myself for 7 weeks by myself
Mm.
with a backpack that weighed about 50 pounds and all the stuff I needed. And I went all over New Zealand, kind of hitchhiking, taking buses, trekking all over, kayaking in Milford Sound, um, swimming in anyway, it
Yeah.
was incredible. And when I think now, I never could have done that using. I mean, I could never got my act together to do it, but I have had an incredible adventurous life. And the thing that kind of breaks my heart about the chronic relapsers is not, I know it's part of our illness, but I think if you don't get out of the beginning time, like the really thick icing, the best parts come with time. I mean, my
Yeah.
life I haven't been bored in decades, and I was always bored the first year. I was like, God, can something happen here? Am I going to have to go bowling? What am I going to do? I could only mess up experiments so many times, but whatever it is, play music, buy a plane ticket, anything.
Yeah.
Uh, and when the truth, this is the thing about the neuroscience that I really got clear on. The more we take the drug, the less it works. And in fact, it creates the state that's the opposite of the one we're seeking. So I loved how alcohol in the beginning made me feel relaxed and kind of copacetic and like I got this, this world is not that brutal. And then later, I mean, I was only drinking to keep away the brutality, to keep away the misery. And the same with every other drug. So yeah, I think it's not an adventure in the long run for me anyway. It was like living in a 3 by 3 dark closet. Every day was predictable. Every day was more the same. I had plenty of ideas and nothing happened.
And I agree with you, and sitting on the opposite side of her, being kind of doing this experience for over 2 decades. I know that. I know it. I've seen it. I've worked with it, and I know it. But we can't know what we don't know or what we haven't really experienced. And so I think that's one of the biggest problems with addiction is like, you're right. If you don't get past, I'm going to say, call it like 5, maybe even 10 years. I mean, I remember I used 12 shot to get sober, and I was heavily involved for a long time. And then I started layering on a lot of other things. At my 10-year anniversary, 10 years, I stood in my home group and celebrated my anniversary. And I was so angry. I was pissed off. I had 3 kids. We were heavily involved. I was working my ass off. My husband was, we were doing the things of life. And I just thought I should be further along by now. I said that out loud, you know, and that was at 10 years. Sometimes I look back and I'm like, gosh, that sounds horrible. Now my life was pretty amazing, truly, but I was still experiencing some of those things. So if I just want to shake her and be like, just hang in, it gets so much better. And that's why we say things like, keep coming back, or it gets better. Time takes time, because we really do mean it. But it's so hard to know it if you've never had it. And also, when you're young and you've only experienced certain parts of life, and then you've been stunted by addiction, you have no clue what's available to you for adventure. You don't know that you could go to New Zealand. You don't know that you could start a hiking club that turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. You don't know that you can pick up, go back to school and get something. You just don't know. So it is true when we say hang in there, but it's hard in the moment. So the only thing we can do is just keep putting one foot in front of the other and doing the next right thing. So I wanted to segue into, I'm really curious about your research around the parts of the brain that you've been able to identify and study before you started using. Like, what did it look like? What is the research showing you?
Well, unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
But like all mental illnesses, we're learning more and more that it's just an extreme version of what's already going on. So this appetitive nature that we're talking about, this tendency to want more and to want better and to want different, that makes the drug experience, especially for many of us who start when we're young, kind of seemed, for me, it was like a shortcut to adventure. I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect. It gets me away from my parents' thinking and my suburban, constraints. And I get to go do my own thing, behind the Chinese restaurant or whatever. And that seemed like wonderful. So it kind of usurped my natural drive at that point during adolescence to go create an identity, which is, we have to say, hard work. It's hard to be. I think, I'm old too, and I don't remember exactly, but I wouldn't go back to being 13 or 14 for anything, because it's full of failure and discomfort and insecurities. And I thought I got like the shortcut through it. So I think for those people who have more insecurity and maybe more trauma, drugs that are kind of a natural thing to try on the way of trying all kinds of things, trying to pierce things or have sex with this or that, whatever we're doing for our identity formation, we might pick up something. And for those people who have a high interest in novelty and who have, so a need for something different and interesting. And this is related to the neurotransmitter dopamine. So we can see that there are subtle but measurable differences in dopamine signaling in people who are at risk. So all young people have their dopamine kind of at its ceiling. So it's kind of peaking out during adolescence, but some more than others. And then they're going to be especially inclined to like to try new things and risky things. And so for me, risk was like, the best thing. And that was kind of true all along, but especially, at about 14. And then the other thing is we're, like I said, insensitive to punishment. So maybe not so conscientious, maybe not so worried about getting in trouble. For some kids, you could say, this is a bad thing, like don't do drugs or just say no. And maybe they do it. But for me, that was like, really, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to do 3 of them, today. So I was kind of naturally going the way I wasn't supposed to go. And I think that's also a tendency. So that could look like conduct disorder, really. We're not the kids who are going to color in the lines. And for my money today, I would say, and I would say this with some caveats, but we don't really need a bunch of people coloring in the lines. That's not what the world's calling for right now. The world needs people who are willing to go kind of out of the box. But the problem is there's so many high potency substances and they're everywhere that I think, the way of going out of the box is more and more to pick up lethal substances and then, self-destruct. So that's not so great. But every addictive drug shares this ability to activate a dopamine pathway that tells us kind of like yum, or, oh, this is interesting or titillating or tasty. It's the same thing that sexual foreplay or chocolate cake might do. But drugs do it, and they do it to more or lesser degree, not equally in everybody. So there's that component. And then the other component is really escaping our situation. And so kids who have more to escape, so they had early trauma, or their parents are depressed or substance abusers, they pick up the drug and it kind of serves like medicine. So it's the yum and it's the better. And so we don't all experience those things the same way. And one thing we've been learning, and I'm interested in this now, is the sex differences in those tendencies. So for all young people, a lot of it begins with the yum. But especially for women, the relief or using drugs to cope is a big mechanism, more so we think than in men. And that's unfortunately seems to be because women are more susceptible at the biological level in their brains and bodies to stress. They're twice as likely, at least, to have every stress-related disorder, including things like lupus or arthritis or depression. And they're just biologically more sensitive. And so therefore it's going to kind of work better. So when someone who's stressed drinks alcohol or takes a sedative, another sedative, it's going to really be meaningful, as opposed to if you're not that stressed, you might not like the sloppy feeling.
I'm curious about this gender piece just for a hot second, but because my work obviously is around trauma, and I know a lot of the research does support the relationship between trauma and addiction, and it seems very obvious to me because trauma, we know what it does now with all the brain research. We know what it does to the brain, so we know it leaves like these stains on the brain. It creates those neural pathways that also include negative beliefs about yourself, that it gets stored in that back part and then kind of continued on through the rest of your life if they're not rewired. So, but I don't know if the research has shown this or not, but I don't know. I was curious about if you're saying that women are literally born different like that, or if their nature for being exposed to trauma is much more apparent, or like it's more prevalent. And so then therefore, and or possibly our hormone structure and other things that are biological then lends us to be more susceptible to stress disorders.
Yeah, well, it's a long story and it's a hot topic, like you said.
Yeah.
When I started as a neuroscientist, this is like in the 80s and 90s, basically all the research was done on males, male rats and mice and male humans. It's unbelievable. And the kind of embedded notion was that, well, they're kind of the default sex. And once we figure everything out in males, then we'll, get around to anybody else. The interesting thing is that the data didn't work out so well. Like we weren't figuring things out. And part of the reason was because we are heterogeneous. We are not the same. And it's not even just male and female. We understand now that biology is much more interesting and diverse than, just one color, one gender. So when we started studying, we found that there are genetic differences, there are hormonal differences, there are neurobiological and neurochemical differences that relate to those things. But for instance, this kind of woke me up in the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain that coordinates the stress response. The cells in there, when they get the stress signal, for males, they kind of do a funny move the proteins do where they dampen the signal. And for females, they do a not so funny move where they enhance the signal.
Mm-hmm.
So the same stressor in males is kind of attenuated and in females is exaggerated. And that's at the cellular level. So we respond to those stress hormones really differently. Why that is, I mean, it's also pain related. So women, you'd think maybe that they should be less sensitive to pain. I mean, after all, many of us have children. But no, women are more sensitive to pain. They feel it more. They absolutely do. And it's not just that men are acting tough, because it's true in rats and mice and monkeys and everything else where they have no thing like that. It's just biologically, they're more sensitive. And I don't know the reason for that, but since I don't want to leave people hanging, I think the reason might be, unfortunately, that evolution selects for survival of the population. And it's probably better for offspring if about half of us are kind of immune, naturally tolerant to pain and stress, and the other half are naturally enhancing, because then whatever's called for, there'll be somebody there to take care of you. And it's just a bummer.
That makes total sense. Thank you. I know we're kind of nerding out on all of this science stuff. And
Sorry.
for those of you who maybe are kind of like googly eyed now, like hang in there with us because I really do want to kind of bring it all full circle, right? I know. And in your book, I'm sure you go into all the details, which you guys can read about when you read her book. And so then
Not
kind of
that
coming
dry.
around to what?
I said it's not that dry. I try not to nerd out too much, and the editor
Yeah.
took that out.
Yeah, I'm
So
sure. I'm sure it's very fun. And so, we know this now. And so then that helps us to understand, all of this stuff I feel like is just deeper understanding around addiction. It doesn't excuse our behavior or things that we have done or the wrongs that we have been involved in, but it does help explain it. And I think sometimes that's helpful, right? When we can put a name on things or we can be like, oh, or like even, I was just working with this anxiety group as a part of our church is running some mental health stuff as a part of some surveys that they have done an entire congregation around mental health. And they got back a lot of data that showed a tremendous amount of people are struggling. And so they brought in groups that we were supporting. So I was running the anxiety group and the curriculum was really nice. And there was a neurosurgeon or neuroscientist that was part of it. And she talked about anxiety and like what is happening in the brain and your body. And I really value that because even though I don't necessarily like feel that I need that, or I'm not a scientist, I do think a lot of people do make the connection between, oh, this is like actually something that's happening in my body and our brains are wired this way. And it helps to kind of explain it. And also it's a little bit of a relief, I think, for some to be like, oh, this isn't my fault. It helps to give us kind of like again, not an excuse, but just a little bit more understanding. So that's why I think this is important. And so as you kind of went down the line and further into your studies on research, and maybe even in work with people that you do around and who are in recovery, I guess what are some of the things that you have found that are really supportive in like the treatment world, like when it comes to um maybe not just formal treatment. I say treatment, and I mean a global view, all the things, all the layers, for helping to support us, even long down the road, even years into a recovery life. What are you guys noticing with that?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, and this has really been a revolution in neuroscience and also a revelation as I've gone through recovery. I thought that I was going to fix the broken parts of my brain, and that's what I was going to get all this studying done for. And what neuroscience is showing, and jives with my experience, is that my brain is kind of a recipient of my environment and my biology, and my predispositions, but that there's this whole burgeoning field called social neuroscience, where we realize that our interactions with nature, with other people, with diet and clean air and the night sky, all of that informs and kind of changes our brain states. So to look for the solution to, like, say, my substance use problems in my head was completely missing, 90% of the story. There's stuff going on in my head, but it's really responding to things that are out there. And what that means is that I need to connect to nature or to other people, to healing opportunities, to therapists, to friends, to listeners, to lovers, to family. All those things are going to change me. And that takes a lot of time, especially if you're used to, living under a dock or something. So I think that that's really clear. Really clear. We're not islands, with our brain determining what we do. Instead, our behavior and our choices that move us in different ways can really impact the brain to influence our responses. So I think that I've had my mind blown, and I've also learned in my recovery, that the the connections are the most important thing. I think, if I had realized that, I probably wouldn't have become a neuroscientist. But then, as you said, I wouldn't understand what I understand, which is to really say, I now know that there's not a faulty gene or a faulty chemical or a faulty pathway. In fact, my brain is healthy and strong. It's capable of lots of things. It got waylaid a little bit, kind of exploited, but yeah, no, that's one of the things, I guess, that's really clear in the science and clear in my own life.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah, what you're saying is that we have to keep finding what feels good to us. Kind of for lack of a better term. I mean, that's like a simplified version. I mean, it means things like, therapy. It means things like natural wellness, like yoga and good nutrition, and being in nature, and really and being connected with other people who serve us, right? So that we feel fulfilled in our relationships, because that's a big part of this experience too, where we're not just kind of living at like a surface level with others. We actually are engaged in a community where we feel a part of, where there's a sense of belonging.
Yeah, and I don't want to maybe say do what feels good, because none of that felt good to me in the beginning. I
Right.
could see what happened, and this fits with the neuroscience too. So addictions come about as the brain adapts to its experiences, mostly drugs, but other experiences, including trauma, including, poor sleep cycles or something. So the
Mhm.
brain is adapting, that causes addiction. And then it can also adapt in recovery, and it has to, or we won't recover. but that adaptation takes time. And what I think for me was so important was to learn that my feelings weren't the most reliable indication of how I was doing,
Yeah.
especially in the beginning. And also my thoughts were probably even worse because I thought the whole thing, anyway. But what was the most reliable indication was my feet. Where was I? What was I doing? Where was I putting myself? And I guess I think that as I look back, from like say the trip to New Zealand when I bought that ticket, which everybody thought was a crazy thing to do. And I was like, no, I need this. Um, and I, kind of fed that part of me. It's like a series of forks in the road. And I chose life and I chose kind of the bigger me over the abusing me enough times that, I was transformed. And I think the transformation didn't come solely from outside me. It came from my choices. And I'm really grateful to have made enough of those choices to have such a different life.
Absolutely. And this happens over time. And I mean, I'm not talking about in the first even 1 or 2 years, but as we continue to make those kind of choices over significant amounts of time, I think if you're doing the work, like the work that I do in my program when I'm coaching women is to help them rebuild trust in themselves. That's what I hear a lot. I can't trust myself. I can't make good choices. And so we have to do that by doing super simple, systematic things consistently every single day over time, right? That's how we lead to big transformation. And so you're right. And I didn't mean to simplify or make it or give people like an easy way out by saying find what feels good, because certainly in the beginning, and there are even times later on, like oftentimes a Chick-fil-A milkshake feels good to me. I think that's going to feel good, but it is literally not going to later. And so that's not the same thing. So finding what feels good to us might not always be great. Like your trip to New Zealand, right? That felt good to you. It felt right. It felt adventurous. It wasn't probably easy because you had to do a lot of work when you were there, like you're hiking, but it still felt good. So I guess it's not like the easy way out. To find what feels good is not the same as take the drug, I feel better. It's not that way anymore. It's actually do the work that makes your life better and feel better than it did before.
Mhm.
So if we're comparing, right? If it's like we find what feels good now versus like how our life was before, right? So I don't always like cooking meals for my family. I certainly don't like doing laundry or doing all the baloney that has to happen to run my household. But I love my family so much, and it feels so good to me to have a deeply connected, close knit family that I'm willing to do all of the things for that feeling.
Mhm. Yeah,
Makes sense.
exactly. And I think our brain is a consequence, not only of what we come into the world with, and I think we come in a little differently, as we talked about, but it's also consequences of our choices and
Yeah.
our environments. Yeah, so we get some say in that.
It is a consequence of our choices. And sometimes I think depending on what segments you're in the addiction field or in mental health world, this part gets a little bit glossed over or sometimes even completely sidetracked, in my opinion. And this makes me nervous. So this is the next phase that I feel like I'm in. And again, maybe I'm old, but I'm watching, and maybe you are too, all of these young folks come up in our field and the changes that are happening. And this is a whole nother podcast episode, but around things like, you know, harm reduction, things like this that um, are not really for the benefit of the addict, right? So treating addiction with addiction is not really helpful, but we have to really dig deeper and look into like why that's happening. And people often
I'd
don't
love
want to do
to
that.
come back and talk about that. I have a
Yes,
lot of.
please. I'm a little bit on hot topic this week because I got fired up by something I saw. And look, I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. I just know that you have to look at you have to zoom out. And people aren't willing to do that, right? We have to zoom out and see, what is this really about? You have to ask these questions. What is this about? Well, it's
Well,
about
I hear
money.
from a lot of people who wish uh, they had never started
Yeah.
the path of substitution.
Yeah.
because it just kind of keeps at bay the work that is so rewarding that you and I have experienced and are talking about it, that we're here for. So I think it's a way to sell ourselves and each other short in the long run. Now,
Right.
what is interesting and missed in that conversation too is that it takes a lot of support.
Mhm.
And what would we rather have, a prescription or a medical card, or, a good therapist and a good dentist and, a place to live and, uh, a garden to work in. I mean, all those kinds of things are time consuming and expensive, but those are the things that give us the fullest life.
Absolutely. And those things are hard to get. We don't
Mhm.
just, they're just not, aren't, don't, they don't just arrive. Like you have to do the work to get
Because
it.
the drug company, yeah,
And
because
this
they're
is
not.
why people, this is what makes me upset because, there's a whole class and entire society that's like embraced this situation. And that's what I mean by saying like people are being stripped away of the opportunity to make that choice, I think, even though it might sometimes be the wrong one. And, I think it's a disservice. It's because we do have to be held accountable. And people, once you're educated about addiction, once you've been to treatment or someone has told you you have a problem with substances, or you learn that you do have a problem with substances and you're not like your fellows, it is now a choice. Addiction recovery is now a choice for you. Um, and using is now a choice. So I don't know. I got really fired
I
up
could
about
have
it this week.
never made it. I could have never made those choices without, every bit of the support I got.
No kidding. No kidding. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying,
Right.
we do get to decide that. I get to decide it. You do too today.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that we have to treat addiction with addiction. And then, because of course they're going to want that. Of
Because we're not
course they
hopeless.
want that.
And we're not
Yeah.
hopeless.
And people
We are
will
not.
choose the drug. They will. If you give
Hopeless.
them why wouldn't you? I would.
I
I
would
mean,
have.
yeah. So I don't know. We should talk about that another time. Um,
Okay.
Anyway, so I love what you're doing. Your book is available. It's amazing. Your work is so valuable to our community and to really anybody, and also people who are, maybe raising children. I have three, young adults in my family, and it's something we talk about, and they were raised with on the regular because it is a very, scary thing out there for them, I feel. So people who want to get more educated around what this looks like and maybe even some prevention strategies, I think it'd be really helpful. hmm So I appreciate your
Absolutely.
time and obviously your work. And I really look forward to, coming back together and having more conversations and for my community to hear this conversation. So where do you like people to reach out to you if they want to get more information?
Yeah, sure. You can look for me at Bucknell University, which is in central Pennsylvania. And I have a website there, but also you can get my email address there if you have questions about the book, which is called Never Enough: The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. Or I'm hopefully working on some new things. So that's the best way, I guess. I don't have my own separate website because I don't have time to keep track of it, but email me and ping me again if I don't respond.
I
And
was
I'd
just going
love
to
to.
ask, are you working on another book?
I'm working on two more, one on kids and cannabis, which would be
Yes.
relevant for you and really is an urgent need. And
hmm
another one on kind of not directed to users or abusers only, but just to the kind of global tendency to look for ways to escape,
Yeah.
and how that is really undermining the flourishing of all of us, and especially well, all of us and the planet and children and our health. As things get worse, we want to cope, and we cope by, as you and I did, by turning our heads the other way and putting them in the sand with substances, or in other ways with pornography or with social media or with gambling or with oversleeping or over shopping. And none of those ways are the path to kind of the flourishing life that we're talking about. So that's the message that I'm hoping to give in that book. And I'm yeah, just slow. I'm also teaching all the time and classes, and I have a family too, although most of them are gone now, but I mean, out of the house.
Yeah.
Anyhow, life is full and rich. And yes, so look me up at Bucknell University, or I'm sure you'll put in the show notes somewhere my email and the Never Enough book.
Awesome. I will definitely link to all that. And again, thank you so much